Got one for your eyes, got one for your strength, got one for your smile, for never lose your wings. Wrote one for your love, wrote one for your soul, got one for your breath, for that I lose control. Till I'm in heaven, there's no choice. I will listen to your advice, and we will chase all ghosts away. There is no bleeding, there's no pain. Refrain, oh, refrain. Got 1 million songs for you, therefore write a song.